Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al-Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken stops in Turkey and Iraq as part of a larger Middle East tour. This as celebrations and rallies in Syria mark the end of the Assad dynasty after nearly half a century of rule. US President Joe Biden sets a single-day record for acts of clemency, pardoning 39 individuals and commuting the sentences of nearly 1,500 others. Time magazine has named President-elect Donald Trump as its Person of the Year again. Well, Time described his 2024 re-election as a stunning political comeback. And 9 British Prime Ministers in the past 30 years, 5 of them in the last 8 years. We ask Sir Anthony Seldon, who's written biographies of all Prime Ministers going back to John Major, will the turnover rate now slow down? Hello and welcome to the programme. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has today been meeting with top officials in Ankara as part of a Middle Eastern tour. Well, it's a regional tour that follows on from the ouster of the former Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. Well, Washington's top diplomat is trying to align with Syria's neighbours and help establish stability through a Syrian-led political transition. Well, as well as talks with his Turkish opposite number, Blinken has also been meeting with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Well, before Ankara, Blinken was in Jordan. Well, he's been highlighting the importance of keeping ISIS at bay, and in a meeting with the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, he discussed the shared interests and mutual concerns of both countries.
There's broad agreement on what we would each like to see going forward, starting with the interim government in Syria, one that is inclusive and non-sectarian, one that protects the rights of minorities and women, one that preserves institutions of the state and delivers services to the people, one that deals with any chemical weapons it may find to secure them and appropriately destroy them, one that rejects any alliances with extremist groups, and, of course, one that does not pose any kind of threat to any of Syria's neighbors. We also discussed the imperative of continuing the efforts to keep ISIS down. Our countries worked very hard and gave a lot over many years to ensure the elimination of the territorial caliphate of ISIS, to ensure that that threat doesn't rear its head again, and it's imperative that we keep at those efforts.
The US Secretary of State speaking there in Turkey. Meanwhile, in Syria itself, the streets have today been filled with people celebrating the fall of the Assad dynasty after half a century of rule. Well, the HTS leader, Ahmed al-Shara, who is better known as Mohammed al-Jalani, has been calling on the people of Syria to celebrate the victory of their revolution. Well, thousands of Syrians made their way to the Umayyad Mosque today on this, the first Friday since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Well, for more on this, we can speak now to Malik al-Abdeh, who is a Syrian journalist and managing director of Conflict Mediation Solutions. That is a consultancy focused on peace initiatives in the Middle East. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Malik. You're in Gaziantep, a short distance away from the Syrian border. And we were just looking at some pictures of celebrations in Syria before we crossed to you. Do you think the people there and their jubilant celebrations there represent the majority of the Syrian people right now?
They absolutely do. They're celebrating more than 50 years, or the end of 50-year dictatorship, which has been a nightmare, really, for Syrians at every level. Economically, the Assad dictatorship has kept Syria backward compared to other countries in the region. Politically, it has suppressed political expression and having a political life in Syria. And of course, in terms of human rights, we've all seen the pictures from Sadnaya prison and elsewhere. So yes, there is a clear majority in favor of the downfall of this regime. But even for those who perhaps were they were in the gray zone, i.e. those who are neither supporting of the opposition or the regime, they're also relieved because finally they could get some economic assistance, sanctions could be lifted, the economy could get back on its feet. And people now realize that as long as Bashar al-Assad remained in power, Syria was always going to be impoverished. So yes, a clear majority are in favor of the downfall of the regime, and quite rightly, they're celebrating.
We just heard the US Secretary of State before we crossed to you, and one of the things he emphasized was that the rights of minorities and women should be represented, that they should be listened to by Syria's new leaders. Are you confident that their voices will be heard?
Well, the international community has many levers and ways of influencing the outcome of a political transition in Syria. Syria needs money, reconstruction money. It needs sanctions lifted. If HTS is to have any future political role in Syria, it will need to be taken off the terrorism list. So the West does have tools of influence. Now, it's worth mentioning that, yes, it's important to focus on issues of minorities and women. However, what we've seen so far, and admittedly it's only been 1 week so far, but what we've seen is that these rights have been protected by the new government. How long that will continue for is uncertain, but I don't believe that the majority of Syrians have an appetite for, let's say, an Islamist regime. People want equal citizenship and rule of law. And they also want free and fair elections. And I think there's a majority majority consensus on this. And so while it's good that the West are insisting on these things, and I believe many people in the opposition also share those aspirations, it's also important to keep the transition process Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, because people have seen what foreign intervention has done to Libya and elsewhere, and they don't want to repeat the same mistakes. So yes, by all means, we need international support, but this needs to continue to be a Syrian-led and owned process.
Yeah, you raise a lot of important points there. I mean, not least the fact that it's only been a week, hasn't it, since these events really started to unfold, and it became, that sense of inevitability that Assad was going to be toppled really only sunk in, well, even less than a week ago. I just want to pick up on what you were saying about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organization that led the fight for Damascus and for the rest of the country. As you say, still designated it as a terrorist organization by a number of Western countries and by Turkey, I should add. I'm just wondering, do you think in terms of removing it from that list, it's going to take one country to take the first step and then others will follow? How do you see that working out?
I mean, to be realistic, it's about the US. The US is the decision maker on this. I can't imagine Western countries taking an independent position without leadership from the US on the issue of designation. So it's perhaps too early to speculate whether the US will remove HTS from the terrorism list. However, it's worth noting that HTS is still on a journey, I believe. And the HTS leader has said that he's likely to disband the organization and perhaps establish a political party with the armed wing emerging into a future Syrian army. So perhaps there is still a great deal of change in terms of what HTS will look like. And certainly if the organization is disbanded, then perhaps the whole issue of designation will be of lesser significance. I think the key question is whether Abu Muhammad Julani, or Ahmed al-Shara as he's now known, whether he is going to be removed from the terrorism list, because his name is he's also considered to be a terrorist, legally speaking. So his future, I think, will depend on to what extent he's willing to abide by the Western conditions in terms of the political transition, but also to what extent he's willing to play along with a number of regional dynamics, be that his relationship with Turkey or how he will deal with Israel, for example.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on an earlier point you were making about international interference, international involvement, whatever we want to call it, but outside parties taking interest in what happens next in Syria. And I think Turkey, I don't know if you agree, appears to be positioning itself as sort of the main player in shaping Syria's future. There's a senior Turkish official who was in Damascus today. I mean, what do you view as being the incentive for Turkey to get so involved?
Well, Turkey has been involved in a number of regional files over the years, not just Syria. They've been involved in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. They've been involved in Libya. They're involved in Somalia. Turkey is positioning itself as an actor that can resolve conflicts or essentially project a degree of Western influence in a number of places, including Africa. And so it wants the West to partner with it in order to reach solutions that are favorable to both sides, win-win situations. And so in the case of Syria, obviously the influence of Iran was a cause for concern by Israel, by the United States, by the West more broadly. And now we can see that Iran has lost big time in Syria, thanks to Turkish backed intervention. So Turkey has done the West a huge favor. It has also diminished Russia's presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's also a big favor to the West. And it's clear now that Turkey is in a dominant position in Syria. And it's quite clear that the message from Ankara is that if you want your problems resolved, then deal with us. But of course, the price is that you take into consideration our national security concerns and also our economic interests in the region.
And you mentioned Russia there, and I just want to ask you, I mean, to speculate really, given that the Russians had such an important role in propping up Bashar al-Assad this last decade or so, do you think that the new leadership and the people of Syria want to see any kind of Russian involvement in how Syria shapes up moving forwards?
Well, I mean, Syria's relationship with Russia is a very old one. And I don't think that it will come to an end. Moscow is ready to negotiate, and it's already negotiating, reportedly, the extension of its use of port facilities in Syria and the continuation of some of its air bases in Syria. And this has been guaranteed. It's almost a foregone conclusion because Turkey and Russia have already reached a deal in principle about this. And it's down to the new government in Damascus to sign a treaty on this. And I think Syrians are willing to accept Russian military presence on the coast if it means that Russia will play a more constructive role in Syria. Now, for the past 8 years, that hasn't necessarily been the case, but Syrians really hope that Syrian-Russian relations will take a more positive turn.
And just lastly, and going back to where we started really with Antony Blinken in Turkey, I mean, just listening to what's come out of the talks between him and his Turkish opposite number, with him and the Turkish president, all sounding quite positive. But there are a couple of issues, a couple of possible points of disagreement, not least the US-backed Kurdish forces in the north of Syria. I mean, do you think they represent a major hurdle to these US-Turkish diplomatic efforts?
They are a hurdle, but I don't think it's a significant one. Turkey and the US will very likely reach a deal on the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the Kurdish forces in east and northeast Syria. I mean, already the SDF is in a much diminished position. They have lost a lot of ground to Turkish-backed rebels. They have their backs to the walls, and they don't really have that much room to maneuver. So I think Turkey will drive a very hard bargain. Obviously, the US will give the Kurds in Syria a soft landing in terms of political rights, cultural rights, the ability to participate in nationwide politics. But what's clear is that the autonomous administration project, if you like, will very likely come to an end. The SDF may continue to exist as an armed force, but only in Kurdish majority areas, and until such time that these forces can be merged into a truly national army. So I think we're witnessing the last weeks or months of an autonomous region in Syria controlled by the PYD/YPG.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Malik, al-Abdeh, thank you again. In other world news, the US President Joe Biden has issued presidential pardons to 39 Americans convicted of non-violent crimes. Well, he's also reduced the sentences of close to 1,500 people. Well, this is the largest single-day act of clemency in US history. Well, one of those who received Biden's favor is a former Albany investment broker, Timothy McGinn, who was convicted of defrauding hundreds of clients in a multi-million-dollar scheme which wiped out the life savings of his victims. Well, earlier this month, Biden sparked outrage amongst Republicans and Democrats with the pardoning of his son, Hunter Biden. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Richard Painter, former chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush administration, who joins us from Minnesota. Great to have you back with us here on Al-Arabiya News. Let's start by talking about what all of this means. 39 pardons and 1,499 commutations. In layman's talk, what does this concretely mean for the people involved?
Well, a lot of these pardons are for people who were convicted of victimless crimes, drug offenses, and other victimless crimes. Where there's a lot of controversy in the United States about how much we should be penalizing people, sending people to prison over use of narcotics, and also there's discrimination between different ethnic groups depending on the type of narcotic and the geographic area. The president has had this power ever since the founding of the United States to use the pardon power to correct what the president believes to be inequities in the criminal justice system. Whether or not one agrees with President Biden on this, it is certainly within his power as president to grant these pardons. These types of pardons are nowhere near as controversial as pardons that are granted to close associates of the president or family members of the president. And we've had some of those under the Biden administration, the Trump administration, and some other administrations. And those pardons can be more controversial. But this is a more standard use of the pardon power to correct those injustices in the criminal justice system that the president believes exist and need to be corrected. It's the constitutional power of the president, and that's what's happening here.
Okay, when you look at the 39 individuals and the 1,499 people who have had their sentences commuted, I mean, are you seeing an overarching theme or an overarching trend?
Well, the theme here is President Biden's concern that we have over-incarceration in the United States. We use the prison system as an instrument of criminal justice too aggressively. We have too many people in prison. Disproportionate number of those people are racial minorities. People come from impoverished backgrounds. And the concern of the Biden administration that using the prison system in this way is counterproductive, and that there are some people, particularly non-violent offenders, who need to get out of the prison system and be integrated back into society rather than remain behind bars, where they may very well be exposed to other people who are considerably more violent than they are.
But I'm just wondering, I mean, amongst the people who've had their sentences commuted, I mean, there are quite a lot of characters that, I think it's fair to say are a little controversial. I mean, there's Timothy McGinn, a convicted fraudster who defrauded hundreds of clients in a massive scheme there. There's two fraudsters in Chicago, one by the name of Rita Crundle, who embezzled about $54 million. Eric Bloom defrauded investors more than $665 million. I mean, isn't this a real slap in the face to the people who fell victim to such fraudsters on such an enormous scale?
Well, financial fraud does need to be taken seriously, and we've had a serious problem with that in the United States. And this is a different group of pardons than the pardons that I was discussing before concerning drug offenders and other more common criminals. The fraud pardons, I believe, is going to be very important to track down whether there was any influence, political influence, connected with the pardons for fraud. I am not familiar with the specific facts of those cases. We've had this before when President Clinton pardoned tax chief Mark Rich, who went on to form various business ventures. And those pardons for fraud can be a lot more controversial because sometimes they are connected to people who've made considerable donations to the president's political party. For example, President Trump's pardoning of Charles Kushner, the father of Jared Kushner, and then Charles Kushner has been nominated to be ambassador to Paris, to France. So I do believe that those pardons for fraud need to be examined very carefully. The president still has the power to do that. There's nothing we can do to stop it. But if there was any kind of political influence behind those pardons, we need to find out. I understand there is an effort by some people to try to obtain a pardon for Sam Bankman-Fried, who was very connected politically in Washington, used FTX money to fund politicians. A lot of politicians on the Democratic side, through his mother, Barbara Fried, who ran the Mind the Gap PAC. And a number of us are very closely watching this situation because we believe strongly that any type of pardon for Sam Bankman-Fried, who's been convicted of fraud, sentenced to 25 years in prison for multi-billion-dollar fraud, would be completely unacceptable. So yes, if these are trial balloons for seeing if that kind of a pardon is workable, I hope the Biden administration realizes that the public will not stand for that. People get very angry when pardons are used to pardon people who've defrauded Americans out of millions, sometimes billions of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, it sends a very confusing message out to the US public, who may find themselves at some point in their lives facing a severe penalty for a tax irregularity or something of that sort. Just to be clear, because a lot of our international audience won't remember this, because we only talk about it sort of every 4 years when a president is leaving office and they carry out these pardons en masse. President Biden issued this statement. He said America was built on the promise of and the possibility of second chances. And I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps there's a message contained herein, which is that, some of these characters are reformed characters. They've rebuilt their lives. They've started again. Is that what this is all about, in a way, as well, sending out a message that, listen, if you are a convicted criminal and you turn things around, you do have a second chance?
Well, the problem is that many criminals who may appear to turn things around in prison do not get this second chance. It's extremely arbitrary who the president pardons, who the president does not pardon. There is a pardon office in the Justice Department that reviews these cases. And I believe it is a helpful way for the president to send a signal about the criminal justice system, particularly the over-incarceration of people for drug offenses and the over-incarceration that disproportionately affects racial minorities. But the notion that the pardon power can be depended upon for redemption, for early release from prison, if you simply turn your life around in prison, that's going to be 1 out of 100 people or fewer who are able to obtain a pardon in those circumstances. But once again, I think this is a signal from President Biden about how perhaps in other ways we ought to rethink the criminal justice system and the over-incarceration. The percentage of people in the United States who are incarcerated is way too high. And there are other ways to address criminal justice. And I think that's right. But once again, I think those pardons for fraud should be given extra scrutiny. And I do not like hearing about possible efforts to pardon Sam Bankman-Fried or anyone else whose family or themselves are tied to large political donations. That's exactly the way the pardon power should not be used.
Yeah, and just lastly, I want to ask you whether you think perhaps this is, of course, we've just heard about what is the largest act of clemency in US presidential history, I believe. Do you think there could be more acts of clemency in the pipeline? Because there has been talk, hasn't there, about these preemptive pardons?
Well, yes. The problem we have here is that President-elect Trump has threatened criminal prosecution of political enemies, those connected with the January 6th investigation, whether it's in the United States House of Representatives or the criminal prosecutions brought against him. And that is an inappropriate use of the justice system to engage in retaliatory prosecutions. That's not what happened in Donald Trump's case. That was an independent prosecutor, Jack Smith, appointed according to the independent prosecutor regulations, who brought those cases, which have now been dismissed because Donald Trump is the next president. But Donald Trump should not be permitted to use the Justice Department to pursue political enemies with prosecutions. One way of trying to prevent that is the preemptive pardon, where President Biden could pardon large numbers of individuals who were involved in the criminal investigations of Donald Trump in connection with the January 6th I do not know whether that will happen. I don't know whether that will be fully effective at preventing so-called revenge prosecutions, but it sent a powerful message that that is not appropriate use of the power of the president over the Department of Justice to use the Justice Department to pursue political enemies. And I very much hope that President Trump does not do that, that he focuses instead on his political agenda that the American people elected him to accomplish.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Richard Painter, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
In other news, the incoming US President Donald Trump has been named the Person of the Year by Time magazine for the second time. Well, Trump previously won the honor after winning the presidential election back in 2016. Well, the outlet was reported to be considering 10 people for the Person of the Year award, including the Vice President Kamala Harris, the Princess of Wales, and the Tesla CEO Elon Musk. Well, in description of Trump on the shortlist, Time magazine said he'd won the 2024 election in what it called a stunning political comeback. Well, to discuss this further, we have two guests with doubtless two different opinions on this decision. I'm talking, of course, about the Donald Trump nomination as Time Magazine's 2024 Person of the Year. We are joined by Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, Pastor Mark Burns. Great to have you with us once again on Al-Arabiya News. We're also joined by David Kusnet, former White House Director of Speechwriting to President Bill Clinton. Pastor Burns, let me start with you. This is the second time that Time magazine has called Donald Trump Person of the Year, the second time in less than a decade, I should add. How's he done it?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me back on. The Time Persons of the Year has come to mean a lot of things over the years. In some years, it means most popular, most influential, most impactful, most interesting, and most intriguing person. For President Trump, it means all of them above. He is most definitely the most interesting person. We have witnessed the greatest political comeback in U.S. history with the re-election of Donald J. Trump, my very, very good friend, as the 47th president of the United States of America. So this got it right. They got it right for the second time. They got it right. Again, because they are looking at the will of the people. And President Trump won by a landslide with the popular vote, breaking his own record that he did back in 2020, and by 3-4 million votes, from 74 million to now 77 million in the popular vote, with 312 electoral votes. It's by all in purposes a landslide because the American people chose him. With the DOJ against him, with Hollywood against him, with every known major institution that was against Donald Trump, the mainstream media against Donald Trump, he yet still won by a massive landslide. So Time magazine is most definitely right to have nominated President Donald Trump as Time Person of the Year.
Okay, let me turn to you, David. Of course, this isn't about being the greatest person of the year. It's about being the most consequential figure of the year. Pretty hard to disagree with their assessment at Time magazine. This was a stunning political comeback, wasn't it?
I'd have to agree that Donald Trump was the most consequential political figure of 2024. And really, I'm afraid of the last 9 years since when he famously went down the escalator at his property in New York City. Now, two things about Time Person of the Year. First, I think if you had asked Donald Trump 20 years ago what his greatest ambition in life was, it wouldn't have been to be president of the United States, but it would have been to have been what used to be called Time Magazine Man of the Year. And in fact, he used to claim he had been selected as that before he actually had been selected. And the second point about Time Person of the Year is looking back, as you said, over time, no pun intended, over time. The people of the year have not always been admirable people. They have been consequential people. And without ticking off the names, some of the people who've been designated Person of the Year really have been very malevolent people. I'd have to disagree with the view that Donald Trump won by a landslide. His popular vote margin was less than 2%. That's one of the smaller popular vote margins in American history. And his electoral vote margin was by no means one of the largest in history, nor was it a landslide. I'd have to say that I'm old enough to have worked as a speechwriter for Walter Mondale in 1984, and I know what a landslide is like. A landslide is how Ronald Reagan won in 1984, and having been on the wrong end of a landslide, I know what a landslide is, and 2024 was not a landslide.
Okay, Pastor Burns, let me turn back to you, because of course Donald Trump's attitude towards Time magazine seems to have changed a bit. He previously dismissed the Time magazine nominees as a joke and as a stunt. Now he's saying that Time magazine is a very important magazine. Do you think he's being a little bit selective in how he views that publication?
Well, I think it's insulting to the 77 plus million Americans that voted for President Donald Trump, again, a third time, to suggest that he or us, the millions that voted for him, are malevolent or in a negative connotation, because again, it is the people, we the people of the United States of America, positioned President Trump to be in the position that he's in. I mean, again, this guy had everything thrown at him, things that no political candidate would have never survived. And yet President Trump, because of the will of the people, held him up and has caused him to again, return back to the White House. We witnessed the greatest political comeback in U.S. history. Again, we see just through the map that there were no blue states, there were just blue counties. But the American people spoke loud and clear by large margins. Again, 74 million people voted for President Trump in 2020, 77 million voted for him in 2024, even with everything thrown at him, the Russia collusion, the impeachment one, impeachment number two, the raid on Mar-a-Lago by the shameful FBI that did it. Again, the consistently DOJ's indictment, having a former president arrested, literally arrested, and having a mugshot, doing everything they can to dismiss his claim. And rightfully, they were trying to dismiss the voice of we, the people of the United States of America. So Time magazine most definitely got it right with everything thrown at President Donald Trump. Yet he was still able to win by significant margins. And the people spoke loud and clear. And I'm really excited for the next 4 years what's to happen. I mean, you see the impact that's already starting to happen now, and he hasn't even sworn in yet. With the fact that Syria has been toppled, Assad has been toppled. We're looking at the fact that Iran could not come and help Syria. Russia this time could not come and help Syria. And those forces are already starting to negotiate a ceasefire within Syria, within Russia and Ukraine now, because President Trump is about to take power. They know that the guy, the boss, is back and America's back, and that aggression is about to cease.
All right, Pastor Burns, I'm sure you've given our other guest, David Kusnet, plenty to think about there. David, I mean, I don't know where you're going to begin. I'll leave it to you to decide which point you want to pick up on first out of what was being said by Pastor Burns.
We want to get hung up on this, but I do want to say that, look, the term landslide refers to the margin, not to the total. Donald Trump got about 77 million votes. Kamala Harris got about 74.5 million votes. The margin, that is not a record margin. That's a real margin. It's not by no means a record margin in American political history. It's less than 2%, and less than 2% is not considered a landslide. I do agree that Donald Trump is the most consequential figure, for better or for worse, in American politics since around 2015. And looking at him in a global context, there are a lot of leaders like him around the world now, and he's both, I think, helped to create a trend, and he represents a trend. And you look at the leaders in Italy, you look at the new leader in Argentina, you look at Nigel Farage, who's made all kinds of gains in the United Kingdom, you look at the AfD party in Germany, and so on around the world. There is a kind of, I won't use a more pejorative term, but there is a kind of right-wing populism that's gaining strength around the world. And the factors that contribute to it are very similar around the world. There's anxiety about immigration, there's anxiety about inflation, there's anxiety about the decline of industrial jobs, often good-paying unionized jobs, and the replacement by precarious jobs. There's anxiety coming after the pandemic in 2020, and it's having similar effects on the politics of very different countries with very different political leaders, from Donald Trump or Vice President Harris or President Biden. So we're dealing with something, while he is, I think, the person of the year in American politics in 2024, we're dealing with something that's larger than one person. And to the point about comebacks, I think part of there is a great American, as there should be, there's a great American mystique about the comeback. If you look at Richard Nixon winning in 1968 after losing in 1960, and then losing for president in 1960, and then losing for governor of his home state, California, in 1962, and having a news conference the next day and saying, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. This is my last press conference." And then you look at Abraham Lincoln, on the positive side, whose entire public career was rebounding from growing up in extreme poverty and anonymity, and having won one election for the House of Representatives before being nominated and elected for president. I think that the comeback is very much a part of American political culture. And a lot of the figures who've had comebacks, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Richard Nixon or Bill Clinton, who was called the comeback kid in 1992, they are people who came back from much more extreme disadvantage than Donald Trump, who inherited, I think, about $500 million from his father.
Okay, Pastor Burns.
I do want to respond to that, because I think, and he's absolutely right, it is a part of American culture to have comebacks, and all of us love to see a comeback. And he's absolutely right concerning Richard Nixon and Abraham Lincoln. These are some amazing stories. But the difference between those gentlemen that did have comebacks versus Donald Trump is that President Trump is the only president that had the entire mainstream institutions lined up against him. The entire institution. There was only the will of the people that was for President Donald Trump. Abraham Lincoln did not have the Department of Injustice to raid his house, or the FBI to raid his house, or to cover up certain incidents like Biden's laptop, where we're discovering these things. We're discovering even right now, 20 to 24 FBI agents were entrenched during January the 6th. You did not have presidents being arrested over foolishness, or having some false allegations from 20, 30 years ago, rules being changed to have him indicted or to have him impeached, not once, but twice, over false allegations, and to have the mainstream media, the entire mainstream media, not just in America, but around the world, spewing out lies about how racist or how malevolent or how evil or how cunning Donald Trump is. But yet to still win the way that he won, to have himself come back to win. That is a story that Richard Nixon or Abraham Lincoln or any other president that has great comebacks could measure up. Those guys had some friends within the institutions of the United States of America. President Trump had no friends other than we, the people of the United States of democracy at its greatest by replying to those that have the power, those that have the money, those that have the influence, those that have the microphone and the power, that the will of the people outweighs the will of the institutions that was against Donald J. Trump. And that's the biggest significance. That's the biggest story. And that's one of the reasons why he is Time Persons of the Year. When he rung the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, he reminded the American people how great our economy was prior to Joe Biden coming in. He reminded the American people that we'll get back to having a strong economy prior to Joe Biden. And so the American people are really optimistic. They're excited. But again, I do agree with my counterpart here about the other presidents, but none of them never had to fight as hard as President Donald Trump had to fight to win this re-election.
Let's put this to David, because it sounds like, Pastor Burns, you are of the view that Donald Trump himself has put forward that he is the most persecuted person in the history of the United States. David, is he?
I'm old enough to remember when the Republican Party called itself the party of Lincoln. And I think they had a right to be proud of the kind of adversity that Abraham Lincoln overcame. And I mean, he and his sister were abandoned by their mother died. They were abandoned by their father in the wilderness in Kentucky when they were like 2 or 3 years old. And Abraham Lincoln came from literally nothing. He really is the American legend to become president. And I think you can make a strong case that he overcame greater adversity than Donald Trump overcame. Richard Nixon, if you read the transcript of the White House tapes, Richard Nixon believed that the entire American establishment was conspiring against him. And that's why he had a burglary unit in his campaign. He certainly thought that the entire American establishment was against him. And Bill Clinton, I think, has always had a modesty about his modest beginnings, but he was born the child of a single mom. His father had died in an auto accident before Bill Clinton was born. And he also came from, in the context of a prosperous post-war America, he also came from nothing. And then I was working for him in 1992. And if you look at the things that he overcame in 1992, you can see why a lot of the media, including, I think, Time Magazine, called him the comeback kid. If Donald Trump has more enemies than friends, that was largely because he made those enemies. He grew up the son of a very politically connected father. Fred Trump was a leading real estate developer, a leading campaign contributor in New York City. Fred Trump had friends in the Republican Party, friends in the Democratic Party. And you look at photos of a young Donald Trump, and you see him with the entire American establishment, especially the New York establishment in the 1980s and 90s when he made his reputation. So if he has all those enemies, they're enemies that he made. And he grew up with all kinds of advantages. And it's not to take anything away from his 2024 campaign, but it was by no means a landslide, much less the biggest landslide in American history. And if you look at the totality of Donald Trump's life, I don't think anyone's going to call him the comeback kid, much less compare the adversities that he overcame with Abraham Lincoln or even Richard Nixon.
Pastor Burns, I cannot imagine you agree with much of what's just been said there, David. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, because again, we're not talking about a life. Now, let me just make this point. $1 million is not $1 billion, right? There are so many people that have taken $1 million and it's squandered, right? So just because you received $1 million loan doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going to have it easy to turn it into $1 billion. It takes a lot of skill, a lot of work, a lot of hard ethics, but we're not talking about his personal life as the comeback. We're talking about his political life as the comeback, right? It is clear that the president had some privileges growing up, but it wasn't easy for him. I mean, again, the enemies that you're saying that was created, again, I'm not speaking to his personal life. I do know about his personal life, and I do know about the hardship that he had to have faced, especially within New York City. The good old boy club that existed even then was against him. The hard work that he had to fight to get the New York Trump Tower built. The fight that he had to have with city council, and the fight that he had to have with the then sitting mayor, who was against New York. And at the time, New York was about to go under, bankrupts. The mayor was traveling around the nation asking for help because the city of New York was at squanders. And President Trump, Donald Trump then, was one of the forces that brought the economy back to that city. Even the governor of New York refused to help the city of New York. And so there is a lot that was put in place that created jobs. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about his political. You're mixing and confusing and twisting the personal life struggles of people like myself or Abraham Lincoln, who came from nothing to become what he is. That part is true. And that is the story of the American dream. And so many people have had greater obstacles from their birth to their stage of success. I can go on about so many people that have had it a harder time than President Donald Trump regarding the personal struggles to become great. But that's not what we're speaking about. We're talking about where Richard Nixon may have thought the institutions was against him. President Trump actually had the institutions against him. Every major notable institution was against Donald Trump which is shocking that Time even named him Persons of the Year because they were one of those institutions, the mainstream media, that was against Donald J. Trump. So when we're talking about comeback, we're talking about the political comeback of Donald Trump and with all the institutions, the Department of Justice, and don't forget the 2 assassination attempts. Let's not just throw those under the rug. They tried to kill this man twice, right? They tried to put a bullet in his head twice to stop him from winning the election. Richard Nixon did not have that happen to him. And unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated tragically, and which is why he's still today one of the greatest presidents that ever existed and ever lived. But Donald Trump is not in that time period. He's in the time period today. And unlike Richard Nixon, he actually did have people spying on his campaign. He actually did have the FBI come and targeting him. He actually did have the DOJ targeting him. And he actually did have people trying to kill him physically with the assassination attempt. But he still won, and he's the 47th president.
Pastor Burns, we're really nearly at the end of this program. I'm just going to let David respond to that. And David, you'll have the last word.
As it says in Scripture, there is nothing new under the sun. It's a terrible thing that there were 2 assassination attempts against President Trump. There were also 2 assassination attempts against Gerald Ford when he was president. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, John Kennedy was assassinated, other presidents were assassinated. There's the pastor mentioned getting $1 million. Donald Trump inherited $500 million, and he inherited a real estate empire from his father. To the extent that he had all the enemies that are spoken of, these were enemies that he had because of what he did in national politics. When he hosted The Apprentice on television, which was a major break for his political ambitions, he did not have all those enemies. The enemies he had were enemies that he made. And the legal consequences that he faced were the results of things that he did. So unlike Abraham Lincoln, unlike other politicians from Richard Nixon to Bill Clinton, who grew up in extreme adversity, Donald Trump's adversity was adversity that he created for himself.
Okay, you have had the last word.
The Department of Justice, you cannot tell me that the Department of Justice, who switched laws to make Donald Trump guilty, to even have him stand for trial when every legal expert was saying this was preposterous to even go to trial. These things actually happened. And not only that, Ford was 2 assassination attempts did happen to President Ford, but Donald Trump was not president at the time. He was just the candidate, the leading candidate. That's how much of a threat he was to the establishment and to those that wanted to silence the power that's behind him. He was not president, he was a candidate, and they still lost.
All right, Pastor Burns, you have had the last word.
If I could add one point.
David, okay, you have the last word when we really will finish. Come on, we have to wrap
At
up.
one point, Theodore Roosevelt was a former president running for president in 1912, and he was the victim of an assassination attempt then, and he actually was injured by the bullet. And as a speechwriter, I'm proud that what saved his life was he had the text of his speech in his jacket pocket, and the text of his speech was so long and bulky that it partially deflected the bullet. So as a speechwriter, I'm proud of Theodore Roosevelt's survival. Not only as an American, but as a speechwriter, I'm proud of Theodore Roosevelt's survival in 1912.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. David Kusnet, you did have the last word in the end. Pastor Mark Burns, thank you as well. Thank you for joining us here on Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn our attention to the United Kingdom, a country that has had 9 prime ministers in the past 30 years, 5 of them in the last 8 years, and 3 of them in the last 2 years and 2 months. Well, let's get a quick reminder of who the British premiers were. Well, as we just saw there, Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, has been in office since July of this year. He was preceded by Rishi Sunak, who was in office for 19 months. Sunak was preceded by Liz Truss, who was in office for just 49 days. And today we're going to be talking about a number of these British leaders, but with a particular focus on Liz Truss. Well, we're joined now by the British historian and educator, Sir Anthony Seldon. Sir Anthony, thank you for joining us. You've written biographies of all the British Prime Ministers going back to John Major, the most recent of which was published a couple of months ago and is about the shortest serving British Prime Minister in history, which is, of course, Liz Truss, who was in office for 49 days. The title of that best-selling book, which you can see on your screens there, is Truss at number 10, How Not to Be Prime Minister. The title in itself is somewhat revealing. Thank you again for joining us, Sir Anthony. I mean, 384 pages about someone who served for 49 days. To be fair, that's about half the number of pages you wrote for your Boris Johnson biography. But tell us a little bit about how you wrote so much about Truss, someone who had such a short tenure.
Well, Tom, very nice to be on your excellent program. And the book is really an exploration of why it matters. Political leadership matters in democracies, and how to be prime minister, and why so many have not performed anywhere near as effectively as they should. The last really effective British Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher, and she fell almost 35 years ago. I mean, that's a third of a century. And I think in my experience of a lifetime, really, of writing about prime ministers, there are 10 rules that prime ministers need to follow if they are to be successful. And spectacularly and unswervingly, Liz Truss broke every single one of those 10 rules. And that explains why she had the incredible achievement, if that is what it is, of being Britain's shortest ever surviving prime minister in over 300 years.
Yes, and you make the point in your book quite early on that 49 days doesn't sound quite so bad when you compare it to some of the, for example, Spanish prime ministers of the last couple of hundred years, 9 of whom who've had stints of less than 10 days, you point out. But you do also say early in the book that from the get-go, the response to Truss was tepid, you said. We all noticed it didn't feel right. I'm just wondering where you think it all went so wrong for her.
Well, the general election victory that's so important to a British Prime Minister, as it has been to Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister at the moment, it's very important they win their own general election victory, because that gives them a confidence and a mandate and a legitimacy. And the general election victory was won in December 2019, not by her, but by Boris Johnson. And so when she succeeded Johnson, many in the party were very angry because they still wanted Johnson to be the leader. And she didn't have broad support from the Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. So what she should have done, and what really any sensible leader would have done, would have been to reach out and win those people over. But instead, she just took no time to try to befriend them and to bring them on side. She just went ahead with her agenda and somehow assumed that she had her own general election mandate and entitlement to embark the country on the boldest economic reform program since Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher spent 2 and more years before she started bringing her own policies into play. Liz Truss spent barely 2 days before she started unleashing her own. So that sense of timing is very important for political leaders, and she didn't have it, and she didn't have the political nous to know that you have to keep your MPs on side, because lose them and you are gone.
Yeah, we're going to come back to talk about Liz Truss in just a moment, but I just want to pick up on what you said about it not feeling right for Liz Truss right at the get-go, and also what you were saying about her not winning her own election. Because, of course, Sir Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, and I imagine you're taking notes for one of your future biographies, I'm wondering whether it feels right with him, in your opinion.
So this is very interesting, because the British general election in July of this year, the Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer did very, very well in terms of the numbers of MPs. I mean, a dazzling majority in the House of Commons, but he didn't do at all well on the votes in the country. So barely a third of people voted for him. So he has to be very careful, not of his own MPs in the House of Commons, as Liz Truss needed to be careful, but he needs to be very careful to make certain he doesn't alienate people in the country, because he doesn't have that broad support that even Tony Blair had, particularly in 1997 and 2001 when he won his own landslide election victories. So they have different reasons for being cautious and careful.
Going back to Liz Truss, you say, quote, she came from nowhere to being a serious contender in the leadership race in the space of a matter of days or weeks. You also say there were some in the party who saw her as, quote, fundamentally silly. And I'm just wondering how someone who people in the party regard as being fundamentally silly ever make it to frontline politics in the first place.
Well, I think it's not dissimilar to Boris Johnson, and people knew, the Conservative MPs knew that he would be a risk and a liability, voting him in to be the party leader and Prime Minister after Theresa May, that they knew that he wasn't, didn't work very hard, couldn't be very consistent, wasn't very good with administration, but they thought it was a risk that was worth taking, partly because there simply weren't the strong Conservative candidates with the ability, with the popular appeal. And it was a different kind of risk. And of course, it worked with Boris Johnson, because he succeeded Theresa May in the summer of 2019 and went on to win his landslide, as we said, in December 2019. So that gamble paid off, at least for a while, because he was an election winner, but then he was no good at being Prime Minister, and he lost the confidence because he wasn't decisive. He didn't steer the country in any clear direction. He couldn't deal with crises well. And it was a different kind of gamble with Liz Truss. She does have popular appeal. She had a very clear Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan style agenda. It seemed to make a lot of sense with the country having such sluggish growth. But the party knew that it would be a risk. With her, it was that she can lack judgment, that she can be very impulsive. I think that's what's meant by the when you say the word silly. I think that's what they are thinking of, that she didn't have that kind of ability to hold back and to weigh up all the options before leaping in. And again, as with Boris Johnson, that proved to be a mistake. And not everyone would agree with that. But with Liz Truss, I think everyone would agree, apart from herself and one or two supporters, it was a mistake to put her in because she blew up the country. And she went for a very impulsive budget. She didn't check that she was doing everything properly. And the country suffered. And it was a big factor in the Conservatives losing the July 2024 general election, and it's been a big source of damage to the country, its credibility abroad, and it makes it look like Italy with this constant transition of prime ministers. Britain had 5 prime ministers in 9 years. Now that hasn't happened before. Very, very unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether you perhaps would attribute blame to what happened before Theresa May took office a bit more. I should point out that you did say in one of your other interviews that you feel that Boris Johnson cheapened the United Kingdom. I just wonder what exactly you meant by that.
So Boris Johnson had many of the qualities that you need to be a good leader. He had optimism. He is a splendid communicator. He has a big vision, but he couldn't be serious. Ultimately, he found it very hard to be serious about anything at all. And it's the job in particular of a Conservative prime minister. I mean, Conservative means that you conserve the state, preserve it, honor it. But he didn't do that, and he humiliated the monarchy, the late Queen Elizabeth, which made her very angry in the prorogation of Parliament. She thought that was intrusive. He belittled the civil service, particularly the Treasury. He attacked them. He attacked the judiciary. And one by one, he attacked many of the institutions that make up the British state, and in his own behavior, his personal conduct, his inability to give that kind of example to other people inside and outside politics of what it means to be a hard worker, to show integrity, to show sacrifice, to show judgment, to have principles, to be honest. All of these were called into question, and trust in British government that was running low anyway declined significantly under him. So that was the sad story, and even his supporters who were desperate for him to become prime minister, by the end, almost all of them had felt that he simply wasn't capable of doing it. It's like having somebody as captain of a football team who might have some of the qualities of being a captain, of being able to communicate and enthuse everybody, but they're no good at football. He was no good at politics or government in particular.
Yeah, and I think this is an extension of what you're saying, but you've said that recent British leaders have tended to be all about trashing without reforming. I mean, you're talking about trashing institutions, trashing things, but without offering any suitable replacement. I mean, do you think American politics is perhaps having an overarching influence on British politics and the style of it?
Maybe. I mean, the whole notion formed in part by digital technology that we have to destroy, we have to be disruptive, we have to fundamentally reorganize and replace. And look, there's a lot of truth in that. If we look at the British state, if we look at the judiciary, the police, the health service, the civil service, the military, indeed, we can see that there are lots of areas where improvements need to come in, but just to denigrate them without improving them, well, that's not what leaders do. Leaders should be supporting while also transforming, whereas he was destructive without making any of those institutions better at all, or indeed the great prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, the Labour leader Clement Attlee, Winston Churchill. They left the state and they left the country and the union stronger than when they inherited office. So now Donald Trump, who knows what he's going to do. He didn't leave the institutions of American government stronger when he ceased to be the president in January 2021. Let's see what he does this time round. He's making very threatening noises about the FBI and the CIA and the whole quality of government, and he's bringing in reformers to slash the size of government, and I'm sure that needs to happen. The question is, can he retain the best people? Can he retain the morale of the institutions that make up the American state? Any country on earth of the 220 are dependent, every single one, of all different kinds of political system. They all depend upon officials to run the engine of the state. And if you denigrate and collapse morale, then you don't get a high-quality, high-performing public service. And that's what we'll see. Maybe Donald Trump will pull it off. Who knows?
The turnover of British prime ministers has been high, as you pointed out, and I'm assuming that as the nation's biographer of prime ministers in chief, that's kept you very busy and meant you've had some pretty tight deadlines turning books around. You're sort of 2 biographies behind at the moment because the Trust book has only just come out. Then, of course, I'm assuming you're working on your Rishi Sunak one. Then there'll be the Sakir Starmer one. Do you ever anticipate writing a biography about Nigel Farage?
Well, if that means will Nigel Farage become Prime Minister? Well, if he was to become Prime Minister, I would certainly write on him. But I wouldn't write on him. So Nigel Farage is unlike, I think, any leader in British political history. So we've had the Prime Minister since 1721. Going on 304 years come next April. There's never been somebody who's come in from an insurgent populist party and made such an impression. So now we can see part of that heritage in Trump himself and in Emmanuel Macron. But who knows? I think it's unlikely that he will become Prime Minister. But one thing we know is that there is extraordinary, supreme volatility at the moment in elections, both for sitting governments and for challenger governments. It's very hard to predict. There's a lot of disillusion with the lack of economic growth in Europe, and where people are cross, angry by their poor economic prospects, they do tend to turn to extremes of both the left and the right. So there is Nigel Farage sitting very prettily on the right. It is not at all impossible, even if I think unlikely, that he will become Prime Minister. But who knows?
Yeah, I mean, of course, for the benefit of our viewers, Nigel Farage heads up the Reform right-wing political party. And do you think it's fair to say that perhaps the common denominator for a lot of the chaos that we've seen in British politics these last 8 years coincides quite neatly, in fact, with the Brexit referendum?
So the Brexit referendum that took place in mid-2016, I think, was both a cause but also a consequence of a deep malaise in the country, in Britain, which also exists in particular in Europe. But you can see echoes of it in South Korea, for example. So in Europe, where you have Europe used to be the powerhouse of the world in the 19th century and for the first part of the 20th century. But since, in particular, the late 20th century and in particular the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, growth has been sluggish in Europe, in particular in contrast, well, obviously to China, but in contrast to the United States. And that in part explained Brexit. The belief was that Europe is very overly bureaucratized, too much red tape, too many restrictions for entrepreneurs, creativity, business flourishing. And it was a desire to get sovereignty back away out of the EU and back into Britain. And of course, the fact that it hasn't worked out, there hasn't been growth since. And even the big claim of getting more money into the NHS hasn't happened, and getting immigration down hasn't happened. So it appears that those who voted for Brexit were lied to. That further stokes up unrest, and the belief is, it wasn't Brexit that was wrong, but it's that Brexit hasn't been implemented properly, and the people in charge of the Conservatives, in charge of the government since Brexit, haven't been, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss included, Rishi Sunak included, didn't pursue the Brexit ideal. Now, Nigel Farage promises to do a proper Brexit and no doubt have a trade relationship with the US. And so it's an attractive promise, even if it's unachievable.
Just lastly, and briefly, because I'm sure you have to move on, but there have been, as we've been saying, 9 prime ministers of the UK in the last 30 years. I just want to ask you, in very simple terms, who was the best and who was the worst of them?
So that is an extraordinary number, 9 in 30 years. I think the worst, that's easy. I mean, the worst was Boris Johnson in terms of discrediting the country and making promises that he didn't fulfill. I mean, he made Brexit happen as the head of the Brexit campaigning organisation, but he didn't yield the benefits from Brexit. Liz Truss also very poor, so I put them at the worst. And amongst the best, I would include certainly winning elections, Tony Blair, but I think he let himself down over the Iraq war. And that is a stain on his premiership. So who else would there be? David Cameron did some good things, but Libya wasn't a success. I think that John Major, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, very much denigrated at the time, but with hindsight, he looks like a very successful hands-on prime minister. But Gordon Brown also steered Britain out of the global financial crisis, so I give him credit. I think almost all of them deserve credit. It's been a difficult time to be prime minister when the country is not growing.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. So, Anthony Seldon, thank you again. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again on Monday for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.